right now, we are in a very important time of the year. Not only from its position from a opportunity side, spiritually and physically, but also an opportunity of growth and learning a lot about ourselves, a lot about the world, and a lot about our holy Torah. This week's Torah portion, this week's parashah, we're reading parashat Vayira. This parasha, according to our understanding, is a shift between the creation of the world and our forefathers. Now this is a statement that maybe could come off as unique. If we look into the actual text, we find that only one parasha necessarily talks about the creation of the world. And that's parashat Bereshit. What the Zohar HaKadosh says about this is that the world as we know it today is completely different from how the world looked at the time of the creation. Or in other words, the world had many stages of reforming and restructuring itself until it got to this point. The reforming and restructuring started from our holy forefathers. And in particularly, Avraham Avinu alav shalom, according to the Zohar and according to all the teaching, stands out as the forefather who built the world and who put the world into the way that we see it today. Even in the Tehillim, there are many times that we refer to Avraham not as Avraham. We refer to him actually as Adam, being that he instituted the world as we know it, and we can even go as far as saying fixed it and brought it back to a place of functioning, where before Avraham there was a lack of functioning. This is an idea that I spoke about it in great length last week, about how Avraham Avinu alav shalom essentially kicked off a new age of opportunity of allowing our world to exist and to move on to the next generation. This week's parasha, like we said, it's a transition. It's the end of Avraham's life. It's the end of Avraham's journey. It's, in other words, the end of the restructuring of the world and the beginning of Bnei Israel as we know it. Yaakov, Yitzchak, the Shvatim, and essentially our foundation of who we are as a people, and less the foundation of how the world is as a creation that we exist on. Putting this in the forefront of this week's parasha, we have to look at what occurs in this parasha and see how does this align with all what we just mentioned. So in this week's parasha, parashat Vayira, there are two very unique, outstanding themes. The first one being where we left off last week, which is the Brit Milah. The first Brit Milah that occurred, its reasonings being unknown, why Hashem asked that specifically from Abraham. And then later on, in this week's parasha, Akedat Yitzchak, the slaughtering of Yitzchak, which for again, has no exact reason of why we did so, and the beginning of Yitzchak's life and the restructuring of Yaakov. It seems like a few awkward, non-connected voyages of Avraham or requests from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but not a clear, structured reasoning or line of how does this come up to restructuring of the world. How does this even make any restructuring possible? And what is the real meaning of the things that we are reading in this week's parasha? And this is what I would like to dive into. So being that Baruch Hashem we are in, I would say, the last parasha of creation, let's go back a little bit to the time of creation to get a sense of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu envisioned the world. There's a famous Zohar HaKadosh that all the Mekubalim started off with, which it is essentially as far as we can go back in history for how HaKadosh Baruch Hu created things. The Zohar HaKadosh says that at the beginning, there was a very simple existence. A existence that we call the state of Or and Sof, which translates to in English, a light with no end. The Zohar HaKadosh says that's as far as we can go back to Hashem. Hashem was this infinite form of very dense light, very different than what the light we know of today. Light today is the absence of something and the presence of whatever light is. That form of light was a very condensed light. The Zohar HaKadosh says that in that form of existence, there was a big baya. The problem being that there was no space for anything to exist. The Zohar HaKadosh says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to create creations. So when we go back to the source and the reasoning of why HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, the Zohar HaKadosh says we can look into a simple analogy of our own lives and get a very clear-cut, concrete answer. And that is, why we want to bring continuation to life. Why do we want to have children? Answer being that in humanity there is an embedded desire to give. An embedded desire to be on the opposite hand of receiving. That's a very godly attribute. And that's essentially the attribute that kicked off the creation of all of the worlds. We call this attribute, in Hebrew, midat ha-chesed. And that actually makes perfect sense. Chesed is happy. Chesed represents like love. Chesed represents giving. When you are happy and in a giving mood, you want to להתפשט, to expand, to have your presence move forward, very much like the attributes of light. Light is always desiring to expand, to travel as fast as it possibly could. That's even how we give a maximum to something spreading. We call it the speed of spreading of light. That is midat ha-chesed at its core. The problem is, the Zohar HaKadosh says, that midat ha-chesed, the attribute of kindness, as beautiful as it is extremely destructive. Where if there is endless light without any quantity, without any limitation, it seems in theory beautiful, but it is essentially a form of destruction. Zohar HaKadosh says, even though HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in that pure state of utter givingness and happiness and love and desire to give and love onwards, there couldn't be a state in which a creation could exist in. The light was too powerful. His desire to give was too endless, and any creation that would exist would be instantly destroyed. Zohar HaKadosh says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu needed to create a limitation. Where goodness is good at a certain quantity. And that certain quantity would allow the creations to absorb that goodness and not have it overbear and destroy their existence. And this is what the Zohar HaKadosh says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the first move of creation. We call this the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum translating to the retraction. The Zohar says that in the center of this endless light, HaKadosh Baruch Hu retracted himself, created a barrier for himself, and within that barrier of emptiness, of where he pulled himself back, only there a creation has the ability to exist. The Zohar HaKadosh says, even though HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world with the idea of Olam Chesed Ibaneh, with the world existing on the foundation of kindness, which was his initial motivation, its existence only comes forth when you introduce Midat HaGvura. when you introduce the attribute of judgment. It makes sense. Judgment is a barrier. Judgment is a gate. Judgment is rules. Judgment is a retraction. When you have a retraction to goodness, you're able to contain it, and you're able to create a third attribute. This third attribute called Tiferet. Another nickname for Tiferet is Etz HaChaim, the tree of life. And that's essentially the ingredients that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had in the basic way of explaining it, and on the basic beginning of time, the idea of chesed, kindness, love and desire to give, but with limitation, with barrier, in order to have that love and that kindness be absorbable, be positive. And that created life. Zohar HaKadosh says that these three attributes didn't just exist within the world. These three attributes were attributes that also needed to exist within the Adam, within every person. Because having chesed and having gvura, having kindness and love and limitation and judgment, would allow tiferet, life, long life to exist. Zohar HaKadosh says, when Adam sinned, he brought a destabilizing to everything. The worlds were broken essentially. The worlds weren't functioning. It says that the rain didn't know when to come, the sun didn't know when to rise, the ground became barren. All the world as we know it lost its balance and lost its ability to continue onwards. The Zohar HaKadosh says that post Adam, there were years where HaKadosh Baruch Hu had no hope, had no plan, and had no clear-cut, step-by-step guide on how the world would return to its original form. We see this with the generations that come. 2 generations simultaneously come forward with having their end be very similar. Complete destruction. Zohar HaKadosh says, until Avraham Avinu alav hashalom came. Whereby Avraham, it says, v'matzata et zar'o ne'eman befanecha. Hashem saw that within Avraham there is a potential to recreate the world. A potential to bring stabilization not only to the world itself, but also to Adam. Zohar HaKadosh says, Avraham was called Adam because he installed the attributes needed for an Adam to exist. And that comes in the form of chesed and of gvura existing and cohabitating within one another. Zohar HaKadosh says we could see with the prior generations to Avraham how this wasn't something that was taking place. Right after Adam HaRishon, you had the generation of Noach. The Torah says, what did the generation of Noach do that they sinned? So Rashi and the Torah expand on it. Says there was a lot of Gilui Arayot. There was a lot of improper relations that took place. And Chazal say that this abundance of improper relation also brought them to a place of stealing from one another. There's a Zohar that says that the idea of Gilui Arayot, or improper relation, stems from a very, very simple place. It stems from chesed. Makes perfect sense. It stems from kindness, from chesed. It makes perfect sense. Why? The idea of improper relations at its core isn't something of hate, isn't something of, God forbid, anger, isn't something of judgment, rather quite opposite. It's a riboy, the Zohar HaKadosh says, a overflow of kindness and love. That overflow of kindness and love could bring a person, God forbid, to a place of having it overflow and spill into places where it shouldn't spill. And then there is utter destruction. Zohar Kadosh says, what was the mistake of the generation of Noach? Was that they said we're going to follow the will of Hashem. And the will of Hashem was Chesed Olam Ibanim. The world is built and exists on kindness. So we should act in utter kindness. And Gvura is a negative thing that shouldn't be led with. That brought them to an abundance of Gilui Arayot. Chazal even say that this abundance of Gilui Arayot spills into other places. It spills into places of, if there is no boundary between me and my fellow, then what is mine, and what is his is also potentially mine as well. Because there is no borders, there is no limitation, there is no gates that separates between Rashuyot. So there is a great desire and an act between people of stealing from one another. Zohar Kadosh says, the generation of Noach failed because of their lack of ability to have balance between Chesed and between Gvura. And their destruction aligns perfectly. You know that the generation of Noach, how did they die? They died from the Mabul. The Mabul is something very interesting. If we look in the Sefer Yetzirah, in the book of creation, you know there are different elements that represent different attributes. Water is a very positive one. What is water, Rabbi Yaakov? Chesed. Water is complete kindness, and on the opposite you have fire, which they don't get along. Fire is Gvura, judgment. The generation of Noach, their destruction came from what? Their destruction came from Chesed, from water. The problem is that they tasted what kindness with no end looks like. They acted in a way of wanting to cancel Gvura completely. Hashem said, you want Chesed? I'll give you as much as Chesed as you want. And that brought them to their destruction. The Mabul was a sign of Bnei Adam leading in a radical way of Chesed. And this radical way of Chesed isn't possible for existence to move onwards, for life to continue. We see very similar outcome with another generation of this time. A generation we read about only last week. Last week, we read there was a city called Sdom. Rabbi Yaakov, what was Sdom's characters? They were rude. They were stingy. All the Midrashim wanting to describe Sdom say that they had no achnasat orchim. They shared no attributes of hosting, of giving. There's an Arizal that says their mistake was the exact opposite. Where the people of Sdom, they said, we're not going to fail like Noach's generation failed. Noach's generation, they did the horrible mistake of going completely to Chesed. That was wrong. We're going to go completely to Gvura. Complete limitation. Instead of giving like the act of Chesed, they were holding back. They completely laktir, they put as their king, as their leader, Midat HaGvura. Problem is, if you have too much Gvura, that too isn't a way of life. That too brings an end to life. What was their demise? So Chazal say, instead of water coming from the sky, they had fire coming from the sky. And that fire represents the opposite of water, which is Gvura. You see that the world was unstable. The world wasn't able to continue on for another generation of life. The Zohar Kadosh says, Avraham was tasked with the goal of fixing Adam and bringing stability back to Adam. Bringing Gvura, bringing judgment and limitation to Chesed, to kindness, and bringing kindness and sweetness into Gvura. Zohar Kadosh says, that was Avraham Avinu Alav Shalom's goal and purpose within this world. Zohar says, that's why Avraham was born b'midat hachesed. Avraham was born b'midat hachesed, following the same chain of events of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. First, he started with the desire of kindness. Chesed olam yibaneh. Then he brought into place this idea of, in order to have an existence of life, there must be limitation, there must be border. Avraham, midat hachesed, and in this week's parashah comes the balancing of Avraham's attribute of chesed, midat hagvura. This is clear with Yitzchak. But this idea even starts to take form and shape in the end of last week's parashah, and the beginning of this week's parashah, with the mitzvah Brit Milah. The mitzvah Brit Milah is a very interesting one. Because out of all body parts, Misken Avraham, give him that one to experiment with. What's the point of that? Why specifically there, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to put his name and to put the challenge in Abraham's hand? The Zohar HaKadosh says it's very simple. Avraham is kindness. There is a body part within the human that represents other kindness. What body part is that? Arizal and many of the Kubalim hold that it is the Brit. That makes perfect sense. The body part that love comes from is the Brit. The body part that wants to continuously give and grow and expand and be a force of growth within the world is the Brit. All the negative ashlachot, consequences that come from ribuy of chesed comes through and from the Brit. Zohar HaKadosh says, the first step of balancing chesed and gvura within Adam was through requesting Avraham to limit the body part of chesed. And it came in the form of the Brit Milah. Zohar HaKadosh says that the reason that we have a Brit Milah within our own lives is to create that live barrier within ourselves, to make sure that we too don't fall into the mistakes that those previous generations did of lost control and went either direction. The Brit was HaKadosh Baruch Hu's way of guiding Avraham in a new path of balancing Adam. And we see this so beautifully in the chain of events that happened at the time of the Brit. Avraham gets mahul. His Brit Milah gets done. What does Avraham stubbornly do? He's panicking. He's stressed. Stressed for what? Rabbi Yaakov, stressed for what? What is Avraham panicking right after he does the Brit? He said, I need achnasat orchim. It's like Avraham he's obsessed. He's obsessed with what? Obsessed with chesed. Isn't that the point of the Brit? To bring limitation to chesed? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to Avraham and says, Avraham, you just did the Brit. It's not a time for chesed. Rest. The Torah says, what does Avraham do? He continues with this obsession. So what does Hashem do? Zohar HaKadosh says, Otzi chama min artika. What does that mean in translation? It means he removed the casing from the sun. There are many places in the Sefer, in the book of creation, in the Zohar, in the Midrashim, where, like we mentioned, the sun is chesed, it's kindness. The sun heals. The sun is light. The sun represents positivity. If you take the sun and you remove all its layers and you put it really close to you, what's the end of that thing? Very hot, no possible life, immediate death. We're like the mabul, when you have too much chesed, with no limitation, with no casing, with no gvul, you end to a lack of life. HaKadosh Baruch Hu immediately took out the casing from the sun. We said, maybe we can say, this was HaKadosh Baruch Hu's way of saying, Avraham, look what happens when you have too much chesed. You end up burning the world. You end up heating up the world too much. Calm down. Relax. Take a step back. Last week's parashah and the beginning of this week's parashah begin the balancing within every single Adam, this idea of having an equal amount of chesed, kindness, love, desire to give, with a restraint, rule, gvura, holding back, in order for there to be continuation, in order for there to be a second generation forward. Zohar HaKadosh says that too is seen with the presence of Yitzchak. We know that in Shmona Yisrael, in the prayer of Shmona Yisrael, the first three blessings are for Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The first blessing is Magen Avraham. Avraham, obviously. The second blessing is Ata Gibor. What's Gvura? Yitzchak. The third blessing is Yaakov, which is Ha'el HaKadosh. What's very interesting is that within Yitzchak's blessing, what do we also pray for? We pray for either a healthy son, Morid Atal, healthy, or we pray for what? Shiva Ruach Morid HaGeshem. We do this blessing in the blessing of Yitzchak, of Gvura, being that Yitzchak's presence in the world at every single angle was meant to create a balance. Where even the bracha of Avraham will come in a limited fashion, will come in a way that is sustainable, that will create a possibility for another generation to come to exist. Zohar HaKadosh, in a very deep teaching that we're going to try to go over quickly, says that in every single way, shape, or form is the reason of the next thing that occurs within this week's parashah, which is the Akedah of Yitzchak. When we look at the Akedah of Yitzchak, it's very strange. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to Avraham, Isha Chesed, the man of kindness, and asks him to sacrifice not only a son, but rather the son that mimeno yikare zera, that from him he will build a generation to come. A generation that, according to the Zohar HaKadosh, were the only Bnei Adams, per se, holding the job of Bnei Adams, which is Bnei Israel, forward. Out of all his children that he had, Hashem asks from Avraham, him sacrifice. The question that we always ask is, how does this serve any sort of a purpose for, even from a story basis and from a logic perspective, how does it feed the narrative? How does it fit in to this story of the forefathers? It seems to be like a test that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put in front of Avraham, that there isn't a continuation, there isn't a good outcome to it. But rather the Zohar HaKadosh says that this week's parasha, in every way, shape or form, is that creation of life, creation of balance. And we'll get into it and we'll explain. We know that in last week's parasha, the Torah talks about Avraham Avinu alav shalom and Sarah, Imenu alav shalom, being not perfect. Where it says that they were born different like other human beings, without the ability to bring children. Obviously, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what he's doing. And obviously, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows when to put certain things in place in order to reach to his goal. The question that we always had is, if you're choosing Avraham to be loyal bloodline, why do you make him unable to bring children? What's the point of this? So maybe Hashem just wanted an interesting story, so he made him not be able to have kids, then yes, be able to have kids, like a twist. But clearly that's not just the only reason. So how can HaKadosh Baruch Hu choose a person to be his continuation of humanity, but on the other hand, at the minimum, having the ability to have kids? So Zohar HaKadosh is something incredible. It says that Avraham Avinu and Sarah Imenu aleh shalom, when we say that they were unable to bring children, It's even much deeper than that. The Zohar says that their blemish wasn't just physical, but was even rooted in a spiritual manner. Zohar Kadosh says that every neshama has not only the ability just to have life and to exist and to give the body life, but also has the ability to pull down a fellow neshama. So think about it like this. When two bodies have children, a person is born, a person needs a soul. That soul doesn't just fall into the body out of nowhere. Zohar Kadosh, it's pulled down by the parents. That's why there is many Chassidiyot that were very particular on how they have children and when they have children, being that the moment of the act is when the soul gets pulled down to the body. There's a Zohar that says that Sarah and Abraham had no ability to pull down neshama. So not only like what Mefarshim say that she didn't have a rechem, she didn't have a womb, but even spiritually it was impossible. So she was both physically and spiritually finished. Zohar Kadosh says that when Sarah was praying for a child, Kadosh Baruch Hu came to Sarah and he said, Sarah, we have a big problem. What's the problem? The problem is that if I was to bless you with a miracle, that your body will somehow grow a womb and you will have a child. There's another baya, and that's he will be missing a neshama. He'll be soulless. Because if you and Avraham can't pull down a neshama, how is he going to be alive? There's a Zohar that says that Sarah made a deal with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And said, Hashem, if I personally can't pull down a new neshama, let's do something else. Bring me a child and have this child draw life from my neshama. This is a concept that in the Zohar is actually fairly common. And it's most presently brought with the famous story of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yitzchak. It said that there was a big Rav that was the student, the Chavruta, the study partner of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that passed away. When he passed away, it says that Rabbi Shimon was very upset because now he doesn't have a study partner. So the Zohar HaKadosh says that Rabbi Shimon went up to Shamayim and he said, bring me down my study partner now. Shamayim, they said, look, Rabbi Shimon, we all want to listen to you because Rabbi Shimon was a very scary figure, here and up there. But that's it, his neshama is done, his time is up. He can't be just sent down to the world because you want. There's a timing. The Zohar says, Rabbi Shimon said, fine. If his neshama can't give him life, have his body draw life from my neshama. The Zohar says that that's essentially what happened. We call it like an arvut. It's like a collateral. One neshama can give life to two bodies. When Rabbi Shimon was about to pass away, the Zohar says that Rabbi Shimon said, call me Rabbi Yitzchak quickly. Because the moment Rabbi Shimon's neshama leaves, so too will Rabbi Yitzchak. So he said, be careful. Make sure he's aware that he's going to die the moment that he dies, in order that he will not be, God forbid, desecrated or unproperly at the moment of passing. And the Zohar HaKadosh says that when Rabbi Shimon passed away, so too did his study partner pass away because they both shared the same neshama. The Zohar HaKadosh says that when Sarah asked for Yitzchak and prayed for Yitzchak, she said, Hashem, would make a deal. He can't be born with a new neshama? Fine. Give him a part of my neshama. Zohar HaKadosh says that Hashem agreed to it. And coincidentally, all the teachings of the Kabbalah don't really get into detail, but all mention that Yitzchak was very strange in how he was alive. Rabbi Yaakov, I'm going to ask you a question. What type of neshama did Yitzchak have? What's that in English?
Actually, he cannot he cannot לא יכול ללדת.
Or simple, yeah, neshama of what? Of a woman.
Yeah, woman.
So, Nobody asked the Arizal, why did Yitzchak Avinu alav shalom have a neshama of a woman? It's a little bit awkward. We're talking about Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and in all the teachings of the Kabbalah, we hold Yitzchak had a neshama of a woman. Whose woman's neshama? Why? There was a mistake, wrong address. Yitzchak was from Los Angeles, where things are not clear, chas v'shalom. So, what's the story behind this? So, based off of this, it makes sense. Yitzchak had the neshama of who? Of Sarah. Where Sarah was the source of life that Yitzchak drew his life from. This is for no reason. It's not stam. The reason, we'll get into it in a moment. But this creates a big problem. Being that as long as Yitzchak has the neshama of a woman, like what Rabbi Yaakov just said, he can't have children. This is a big problem. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Abraham, from who you will have a holy bloodline? From Yitzchak. But Yitzchak has a woman's neshama. So what do? So the Zohar HaKadosh says Hashem had a beautiful solution. He called Abraham. He said, Abraham, you have to free Yitzchak from his neshama. Which is a very nice way of saying, you have to kill him. And if you kill him, you'll free him from his woman's neshama. Afterwards, we'll figure it out. But he needs to be freed from his woman's neshama. Later on in this week's parashah, Avraham Avinu alav shalom listens to it without a question, takes Yitzchak and slaughters him. Not with the idea of killing from where his bloodline comes from, rather quite opposite. Giving a chance from his bloodline to continue, because only through Yitzchak it could continue. And as long as he has a woman's neshama, no children are coming from him. Right after the slaughtering of Yitzchak, we have another problem. What's the other problem? Yitzchak is dead. And according to the Arizal, and according to many of the Hasidic teachings, Yitzchak was actually slaughtered. Where Arizal even says that he was not only slaughtered, he was burnt back to ashes. And that's why, if we go back to what we mentioned a minute ago, where the second blessing in Shmona Esrei is Yitzchak's, we say Ata Gibor, then we say Moshiv Aruach Morid HaGeshem in today's case, and then what's the blessing itself? No, what's the blessing? The resurrecting of the dead. Very strange why we would do that to Yitzchak, if there wasn't an aspect of Mechaya Metim by Yitzchak. Zohar HaKadosh says, Yitzchak is dead. Like we mentioned, according to the Arizal, not only was sacrificed, he was burnt. And afterwards in the class, if you want to do some math, you'll find that the only way where the Torah's math adds up is if you consider that Yitzchak was dead for 3 years. We'll get into that maybe later on. Now, Yitzchak has an opportunity to be freed from the neshama of Sarah and something else. The Torah says that Avraham Avinu alav shalom looks at Yitzchak at the time of the Akedah, in this week's parashah, and he says, Eneni beni, which the Mefarshim explain it to. Avraham looked at Yitzchak and said, Yitzchak, I am now my son. What does that mean? Based off of this, we can say maybe Avraham Avinu alav shalom did the exact same thing that Sarah did. What did he do? He said, now that Yitzchak is no longer alive, has no longer Sarah's neshama, I'll put up my neshama. Where me and my son will be linked and will be one. Where now Avraham will give a part of his neshama to give life to the body of Yitzchak. We see a small proof to that. In a few parashot, we want to describe who has who. We say, Ele toldot Avraham, Olid Yitzchak. This is the life of Avraham. Avraham, who? The one who gave birth to Yitzchak. A man doesn't give birth. A woman gives birth. But based off this idea, you can say that the same way that a woman, or especially Sarah in this case, gave her life, a part of herself, to give her children life, so too did Avraham. More importantly, at the time of the Akedah, more than ever, Chesed and Gvura were able to exist and were able to connect themselves like one, like never before. We're at the time of the Akedah. For the first time, Chesed and Gvura existed equally and simultaneously in the most dramatic ways possible within one living body. Zohar Kadosh says, all of this was just in order to create who? To create Yaakov, to create Bnei Israel, to create the tree of life, to create a generation that could exist due to the fact that they both share Chesed, kindness, and Gvura. From this we could understand that literally this week's parashah is the sealing of the setup of HaKadosh Baruch Hu giving all of us the chance to exist, to live lives that are true life, stemming from the fact that we have the vessels and the tools to balance these two very different, very hectic, very radical midot attributes. And I think that this is, in many ways, a big challenge that we see even in our generation. We see a generation that for a long time went very south. There's like a pull of be loving, be accepting, midat chesed in the highest form of existence. We see that this great love and acceptance and kindness, like how it existed in the past, doesn't create for good generations onwards. We think that if there's any challenge that our generation holds, is finding that balance of chesed and gvura, of finding when to hold ourselves back, of finding when to push ourselves forward. We live at a time and we live at a place where radicalism has never been more present and has never been more popular. If there's anything that we could learn from this week's parashah, the end of last week's parashah, and moving forward, that a life that has continuation is a life that is able to find balance between these two very different midot that exist within us. And only in that way we can find the ability to live spiritually balanced lives, to live physical balanced lives, and to learn from the foundation that our ancestors put in order for all of us to come to a place of prosperity. So Be'ezrat Hashem, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu give us all so much bracha and so much siyata d'shmaya to learn to wield these two very different swords, and hopefully to find a complete presence of Tiferet, of Torah, of the tree of life, of continuance within our holy lives. Amen. Kinyatzon Be'ezrat Hashem. Leave it. Is there any questions?
Yeah.
Ken Avital Tzadika. Avital, it's the first time that Avital asks the question, so.
I only have a question.
Usually everyone asking you questions. Now it's opposite. Baruch Hashem.
Did Abraham know that Sarah went to Hashem and sacrificed for Neshama when she did it?
So we wrote something about this. According to our understandings of it, the real sacrifice that Abraham knew that he was doing was sacrificing Sarah. And we see that when he comes back and we see Sarah dead, he's not surprised. In the end of the parashah it says, "Ve'avo lifkota," to cry for her. Small letter. The letters are very small. Why? It says that he cried a little bit. How does this make sense? How does the man of kindness and love see his wife that just passed away and cry a little bit? That's not like an act of kindness and love. So the only answer that makes sense is that no. Avraham knew that by the Akedah he will save his bloodline, but by the Akedah he will also lose Sarah. So if there's anything that we can say that this test being a test of Avraham, it's from that aspect. Because he was promised, from Yitzchak you'll have children. So does Hashem make promises and not keep? We say every day, Baruch Omer Ve'oseh. We say, one of our prayers is to Hashem that whatever he says, he does. So how could HaKadosh Baruch Hu say that he'll have kids, and then he go and slaughter him? So our understanding from it is the Akedah was her sacrifice. And even more than that, that she knew that by Avraham going and doing this sacrifice, that so too she knew on herself that she would pass away. So it was a sacrifice on both sides of Avraham and Sarah, which makes the story so much more meaningful and also adds sense to so much of how our forefathers are reacting to these things that are unfolding.
One question. When Abraham passed away, how come his still was
Beautiful question. So if you look in the parashah, Hashem, the Torah gives not even a word of a break. It says, Vayamut Avraham, Vayivarech Elokim et Yitzchak. So Avraham passes away, and immediately afterwards, Hashem blesses Yitzchak. What was this blessing that Yitzchak was blessed with? The Torah doesn't say. So it would only make sense where, now that Abraham was passing away, Hashem said, you know what, Yitzchak, I'm going to bless you with some. What could it be?
life?
Could be with life. That's what makes sense. Because why would it be so? You can look at it. It's not even a word of a difference. Abraham passes away, Hashem blesses him immediately. It also makes sense for something else. We say that Rivka had Sarah's neshama, right? We say that the oil, the candle, the oil, the tent of Sarah was the tent of Rivka. How old was Yitzchak when he married Rivka? How old was Rivka, Mechila?
3 years.
She was 3? How does that make sense? How does that make sense? No, Rabbi Yaakov. People grew fast. There were steroids. How was she 3? Rabbi Ine, Kol HaKavod Rabbi Yossi. Sarah's neshama left at the time of the Akedah. Coincidentally, when did Yitzchak and Rivka meet? 3 years later. So 3 years right after the Akedah, Rivka is 3 years old. So maybe we can say that it's not that she was 3 years old physically.
That's also the 3 years he wasn't here.
Yes, exactly. That's the 3 years. So just from a timeline perspective, you have Yitzchak gets sacrificed. Sarah passes away. Yitzchak is no longer alive for 3 years. He comes down from Shamayim. He was in Gan Eden. He comes down from Gan Eden, from Shamayim, and he meets Rivka, and she's coincidentally 3 years old. So we can say that maybe her body was 25 or who knows what, but her neshama's presence, Sarah's neshama's presence within Rivka only could have been when Sarah was already no longer alive. And that's 3 years prior to them getting married. So that also makes a lot of sense.
2 questions. First, we know that actually Abraham Avinu is Midat HaChesed, completely Midat HaChesed. How come he tried to slaughter Yitzchak when he's Midat HaGvura, and we know Sarah is Midat HaGvura? So how come he got that Midat HaGvura? Because he wanted Midat HaChesed. How come he got Midat HaGvura?
That was a part of the reparation of the Adam. So like we mentioned, we started off that Abraham started off his own self-tikkun of creating balance through the Brit. And we saw that fully take shape with Yitzchak, where Yitzchak and Avraham needed to be linked. They need to be connected like one. Where Avraham both shares equally Midat HaChesed in the highest level and Midat HaGvura at the highest level. When both of those exist, Yaakov could exist. Long life, Etz HaChaim, Tiferet, Bnei Israel could come forth. So there's even a famous midrash that says that Avraham and Yitzchak were born just for Yaakov to be born. How can you say that?
Yaakov Avinu is Bechir Avot.
But how can you say that? Bachir? So Yitzchak was preferred? Yaakov was preferred? That's very not nice too. Avraham and Yitzchak. How can you say such a thing? So the answer makes sense. It's that there is no Yaakov
There's no Yitzchak.
if there's no Yitzchak and Avraham. So Yitzchak and Avraham, when combined equally to a T, create Yaakov. So for example, when you want to say, what's Tiferet? Tiferet is the exact amount of balance of Chesed and Gvura, of Avraham and Yitzchak linked together. So this was all a setup for us to have the tools to exist and to be able to navigate our way throughout the world and do the right choices and have a balanced life of Chesed and Gvura. Or if it wasn't for these dramatic tikkunim, Adam would be pagum. Adam will always forever be a radical creation that either ends up like Dora Mabul, or like Zdom, or like a Palaga, all going in one dramatic direction. So, Abraham's reaching of balance to create Yaakov was through doing such an act of Gvura.
There are two things I think. First, we know that Abraham, his son is also Ishmael, that's actually something, and Yitzchak with the son. But Yaakov is only all the Shvatim, so actually that can be pure.
It's perfection.
Exactly.
Yaakov is perfection. Avraham is too much to the right, clearly. We gave the example of the Brit for that. What's the example of the Brit? The example of the Brit is, it was the essence of Avraham being, he was obsessed. Chesed, 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 chesed. Hashem said, calm down. Too much chesed. Extreme. And Yitzchak on the opposite way. He was burnt alive. So their combination gave us the tools to exist with life and to have a Adam, to have a Yaakov. Yaakov was Dukna de Adam Arishon. Yaakov was the first time a human looked like Adam. Before Yaakov, Mechila to say this to Abraham and Yitzchak, but there's as well that says that there was part snake. They didn't look like Adam. They looked like snake. Yaakov was born, Duke Nukta. He looked like Adam. Why? Because he had both the balance of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet. He has a perfect Tzelem Eloki.
There is a connection with the Ot A because Avraham got the Ot A, he didn't have children, and Sarai changed from Sarai to Sarah. And we know also for Rachel no A, and actually that she said that Bilha that I get. So there was any connection with Ot A that actually did have children?
Not that we've seen. I've seen that Ot He is more about converts. There's a few letters that create Yud Kei Vav Kei in the Torah. A few people that were